Once again, the conversation is dominated by rapidly rising borrowing costs. Fresh off the Bank of Canada's most aggressive rate hike in more than 2 decades, Bank Governor Tiff Macklem is leaving the door open to an even bigger move. Speaking Thursday at an IMF and World Bank gathering in Washington, Macklem echoed some of the hawkish talk from his U.S. counterpart Jay Powell, saying he's, quote, not going to rule anything out. That's when it comes to the possibility of moving by more than half a percentage point at an upcoming meeting. The idea of the bank unleashing a 75 basis point hike on June 1st has been generating buzz on Bay Street this week. It's the kind of action we haven't seen since the 90s, but these are not normal times. Inflation is sitting at a 3-decade high, and while Macklem boosted rates twice already this year, they are still at historically low levels. Our next guest expects another 50 basis point move in June and says the bank's credibility is on the line after failing to keep up with inflation. Stéfane Marion is the chief economist at National Bank. Stéfane, good morning. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good morning.
Just to elaborate a little bit more on what Governor Macklem said, quote, we're prepared to be as forceful as needed, and I'm really going to let those words speak for themselves. What do those words mean to you?
Well, you're behind the curve, obviously, so you got to leave your options open. However, I still think 50 basis point makes more sense at this point in time because we're not raising rates just in Canada. It's a global effort. We're seeing the U.S. Going to be more aggressive in the month of May, and quantitative tightening is potentially another tool to be used by the central bank. So my preference for now is to use 50. 50 is the new 25 when it comes to central banks' moves at this point in time. We move quickly towards 2%, and then we see what happens there.
Do you think we should have been in a situation where we have to see 50s instead of 25s? In other words, do you think the Bank of Canada waited too long to begin this rate hike cycle?
I think so, because if you look, since the 1960s, this is the second time since in 50 years that the inflation rate is above the unemployment rate, and I think the last time we saw that was in the 1970s, and these were stagflation years where the Bank of Canada fell very much behind the curve. At this point in time, I don't think we are as behind the curve as we were in the 1970s, but to allow your inflation rate to surpass the unemployment rate means that the Bank of Canada was a little bit too permissive, and as of last November, they were still claiming that the unemployment rate was not a good measure of potentially inflationary pressure, a low unemployment rate, that is. And the last few months have proven the Bank of Canada wrong, so now it's catch-up mode. And again, there's probably 6 months of catch-up to be done very quickly, so that's why we say 50 basis points is the way to go.
This chart that you have highlighted for us, just looking back historically, is quite fascinating to see the unemployment rate coming down so quickly and then that quick spike in inflation, and we don't see those two lines crossing quite often. The reality is that this bank governor came in after we had initially seen rates go essentially to zero and the economy flooded with cash early during the pandemic. The one thing he did seem to have at his disposal were words, the ability to commit to not making a move until we knew we were out of the woods. But did that in some ways put some handcuffs on central bank strategy to try to offer that reassurance to the market at such an uncertain time a couple of years ago?
It's a great observation. I think both, and I'm not just blaming the Bank of Canada on that one, but just using guidance, relying on guidance and not actual actions and moving on rates, I think was a mistake for on the part of central banks. But again, I stress my point. The central banks are behind the curve, but I don't think they're as much behind the curve as we were in the 1970s. And they now need to account for the potential impact of higher food and energy prices. That will slow down consumption. So hence my view that 50 basis point makes sense, and we have to account for this impact, potential impact on consumption. And we saw retail sales this morning coming in a little bit soft.
Yeah, I read that story about retail sales, soft, but people still spending. Meanwhile, we talked about some of those input costs that are surging right now because of commodities. I guess everybody's trying to figure out where we land here, Stéfane. Like the reality is you've got to find a way to fight inflation. But if we're seeing more signs of global cooling for the economy, and that rubs off on Canada and certainly on the United States, can we have a so-called soft landing? Do we run the risk of a recession? What do you think happens?
I think it's easier to get a soft landing in North America. Keep in mind that Canada is a net producer of commodities, so we're less impacted, say, than Europe. I think Europe is in recession. I think there will be a ripple effect in financial markets later this summer when we find out how the type of slowdown that, the contraction in economic activity in Europe because of these surging energy prices, and given the fact that, Ukraine is on its doorsteps and it's impacting their global supply chain, their own production capabilities. So, yes, so I think that's why we have to be prudent. We go to 2% in both Canada and the US, and then we assess the global situation. That's why we think this is not a typical tightening cycle. And on top of that, this quantitative tightening that's moving long-term rates higher and impacted the stock market, as you mentioned, and the IT sector in quite forceful manner.
Yeah, no doubt. Really helpful context. Stéfane, before I let you go, since you also think about the flows in the stock market, the energy sector has been that dominant force, along with some of the materials names this year. That story of Canadian outperformance, does that live on if we start to see some more signs of economic cooling?
Interesting question. If you think I think the stagflation scenario is moving upwards, and if you want protection in the stagflation period, historically the Canadian market on a relative basis should outperform. So we're still overweight Canada at this point in time.
Okay, Stéfane, thanks so much. Great to get your insight and analysis. We'll check in with you soon. Stéfane Marion, Chief Economist and Strategist at National Bank of Canada.